courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as Judge Sarah Miller entered and took her seat behind the bench. The weight of the day pressed heavily on her shoulders. This case was not like the others she had presided over. It was personal, a collision of past and present that she hadn't anticipated. Today, the defendant sitting before her was David Johnson, her childhood friend, now accused of assault and robbery. The murmur of the courtroom dimmed as the bailiff called the case. Sarah steadied herself, gripping the polished wood of the bench. She had worked tirelessly to reach this position, building a reputation for fairness and impartiality. Yet now she faced a trial that threatened to undo it all. David sat shackled at the defendant's table, his shoulders slumped. His face, once youthful and full of hope, now bore the weight of years of hardship. But his eyes, those same piercing eyes she remembered from their childhood, met hers briefly before he looked away. Memories flooded Sarah's mind, unbidden and overwhelming. She remembered summer days in Westbrook, Texas, where they'd raced bicycles down dusty streets and whispered dreams under the stars. They talked about escaping their small, segregated town, dreaming of a world where they could truly belong. But life had led them down vastly different paths. Sarah had pursued her ambitions, leaving Westbrook behind, while David's life had been a struggle, shaped by systems that seemed designed to hold him back. Now their worlds collided in this courtroom, and Sarah had to reconcile the boy she had known with the man accused of a violent crime. The prosecutor wasted no time painting David as guilty, presenting circumstantial evidence that tied him to the robbery. Surveillance footage showed a man in a red hoodie entering the store, and eyewitness accounts placed someone of David's description near the scene. But the evidence felt thin, too vague, too reliant on assumptions. If you enjoyed this intense and thought-provoking video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping content that explores the complexities of life, law, and truth. Stay tuned for more incredible stories. David's defense attorney, Rachel Adams, was sharp and methodical, determined to dismantle the prosecution's case. As she called her first witness, Officer Thomas Blake, the arresting officer, Sarah leaned forward slightly. This was where cracks in the case might begin to show. "Officer Blake," Rachel began, her tone measured and deliberate, "you stated in your report that Mr. Johnson was apprehended 2 blocks from the scene of the robbery. Is that correct?" "Yes," Blake replied, his tone clipped. "And what led you to believe he was the suspect?" Rachel pressed. Blake hesitated. "He matched the description, a black male, mid-40s, wearing dark clothing." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Dark clothing?" The suspect in the surveillance footage was described as wearing a red hoodie. "Did you find a red hoodie on Mr. Johnson when you searched him?" Blake's jaw tightened. "No, but he could have discarded it." Rachel's voice sharpened. "Did you or any other officers search the surrounding area for this supposed hoodie?" "No," Blake admitted reluctantly. "We didn't have time." "So, to clarify," Rachel continued, her words cutting through the silence like a blade, "you arrested my client based on a vague description, with no physical evidence linking him to the scene." The courtroom murmured as Blake's credibility visibly faltered. Sarah glanced at the jury, noting their shifting expressions. Doubt was creeping in. Rachel wasn't done. She called a forensic analyst to the stand, who testified that the surveillance footage was too grainy to definitively identify the suspect, and that the timestamp on the video had been altered. These revelations further undermined the prosecution's case, creating a shadow of doubt that Sarah could feel settling over the room. Then came the most critical moment, David's testimony. Rachel had warned him of the risks, but David insisted on taking the stand. Chains clinked softly as he walked to the witness chair, his movements slow but deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was raw, carrying the weight of a lifetime of struggles. "I've made mistakes," he began, his gaze steady as he addressed the jury. "I've trusted the wrong people, I've taken wrong turns, but I didn't do this. That night I was walking home. The cops didn't ask me questions, they just decided I fit the description. That's been my whole life, people deciding who I am before they know me." His voice cracked as he continued. "All I've ever wanted was to be seen for who I really am. I didn't rob that store, I didn't hurt anyone. I just want the truth to matter." Sarah's throat tightened as she listened. His plea was more than a defense, It was a cry for humanity, a call for justice, in a system that too often denied it to people like him. She glanced at the jury again, seeing empathy flicker across their faces. The truth was no longer just about evidence, it was about conscience. The trial concluded with closing arguments. The prosecutor leaned on the circumstantial evidence, urging the jury to trust the system. Rachel, however, implored them to see beyond assumptions, to recognize the gaps in the case and the humanity of the man on trial. The jury deliberated for hours, leaving the courtroom in a haze of anticipation. When they returned, the foreperson's voice trembled as she read the verdict. Not guilty. The room erupted in a mix of relief and shock. Sarah tapped her gavel, restoring order. David's shoulders sagged as the weight of the accusation lifted, but his face remained unreadable. Freedom was bittersweet when the journey to it had been so fraught with injustice. As the courtroom emptied, David approached Sarah. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly, "but I'd like to know, why didn't you say anything? You knew me." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Because I couldn't. I had to be fair. If I'd said anything, it might have jeopardized everything." David nodded, his expression softening. "Fair," he said, his tone bitter. "The world's never been fair, not for people like me." "I know," Sarah replied, "and I'm sorry." David gave a faint nod before turning to leave. As Sarah watched him walk away, she felt the weight of his words settle deeply within her. Justice had been served, but the trial was a stark reminder of the flaws in the system. She couldn't change the past, but she vowed to fight for a future where fairness wasn't just an ideal, but a reality. In the heart of Westbrook, Texas, a small town with a long history of segregation, two children grew up side by side, bound by the simple yet unbreakable threads of friendship. Sarah Miller and David Johnson had shared everything: dreams, fears, and the comfort of knowing they would always have each other, despite the world's efforts to divide them. Their friendship had blossomed in the sun-drenched streets, where every corner held a memory of simpler times. But as they grew older, life carved separate paths for them. Sarah, driven by her dreams and her fierce determination, left Westbrook to pursue an education in law, determined to make a difference in the world. She rose quickly through the ranks, eventually becoming Judge Sarah Miller, respected for her fair but firm handling of cases. If you enjoyed this intense and thought-provoking video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping content that explores the complexities of life, law, and truth. Stay tuned for more incredible stories. David, on the other hand, remained behind in the town they both had once hoped to escape. Life was harder for him. He struggled to find his place in a world that often didn't give him a chance. Despite his potential, systemic racism and social inequality pushed him into circumstances that were out of his control. By the time Sarah had made a name for herself in the legal world, David found himself trapped in a vicious cycle, falsely accused, wrongly convicted, and often misunderstood. The bond they once shared seemed to fade as years went by, but neither could forget the promise they had made to each other as children. They dreamed of a life where their race didn't determine their future, where they could both thrive. But now, as Sarah walked into the courtroom where she would be presiding over a case, that promise seemed like a distant memory. David stood before her, his face worn by years of struggle, shackled and accused of assault and robbery. The old Sarah felt a pang of shock and disbelief. This was not the man she had known. The man who had once dreamed with her now stood as a defendant, and Sarah had to decide whether she could separate the memories of their childhood from the reality of what he was accused of. The case against David was circumstantial, with weak evidence and a shaky chain of events. Rachel Adams, his defense attorney, tore apart the prosecution's case, questioning the credibility of witnesses and the quality of the evidence. But Sarah was torn. The man before her was a stranger, yet he was also someone she had once loved as a brother. As the trial wore on, Sarah's internal struggle intensified. Could she truly judge him objectively when she could still see the young boy she had once played with? Could she reconcile her role as a judge with the pain of watching a friend suffer because of a broken system? David's testimony, raw and emotional, broke through Sarah's walls. He spoke of the prejudice he faced every day, of being accused simply because of his skin color. His voice was filled with the weight of years of injustice. "I didn't rob that store," he said, his voice trembling. "But I've been arrested more times than I can count, just for being me. All I ever wanted was a chance." Those words echoed in Sarah's mind long after the trial ended. As the jury delivered its verdict, David was acquitted. The victory felt hollow. The system had failed him, and Sarah knew it. She had always believed in justice, but now she was forced to confront the fact that justice was not always blind. After the trial, as David approached her, Sarah felt the weight of the years they had lost. He thanked her for her fair decision, but his words were filled with an understanding that broke Sarah's heart. "Life wasn't kind to me, Sarah," he said, "but I know you did what you had to do." In that moment, Sarah realized that true justice was not just about the verdicts she handed down. It was about confronting the deeper issues, the systemic racism, the unequal opportunities that had shaped both their lives in ways she hadn't fully understood until now. And as she looked at David, standing free, she made a vow. She would use her position to change the system, to ensure that no one else would have to face the same obstacles David had. It was an ordinary Monday in the courthouse. The usual sounds of gavel strikes, courtroom murmurs, and the shuffle of papers filled the air. Yet to Judge Sarah Miller, the scene felt anything but ordinary. Today, she wasn't just presiding over any case. Today, she was about to face a trial that threatened to blur the lines between her professional duty and her deepest personal connection. Sarah had spent years rising through the ranks of the legal world. She was known for her sharp mind, her unwavering belief in the rule of law, and her ability to remain impartial under pressure. But when she saw the name of the defendant, David Johnson, on the docket, she felt the weight of her past crashing into her present. David was no stranger to Sarah. They had grown up together in the racially segregated town of Westbrook, Louisiana. As children, they had shared a bond that felt unbreakable. They had played in the same dusty streets, dreamed of escaping the confines of their small town, and promised one another they would never let anything tear them apart. Yet as the years passed, their paths had diverged. Sarah had left Westbrook, pursuing a successful career in law, while David had stayed behind, struggling against the systemic forces that often left him powerless. Now he stood before her, accused of a violent crime, a crime he insisted he didn't commit. The evidence against David was circumstantial at best. Officer Thomas Blake, the arresting officer, claimed that David was the suspect based on a vague description provided by a witness. But the defense attorney, Rachel Adams, was determined to poke holes in the prosecution's case. She questioned the reliability of the witness's account, as well as the questionable surveillance footage that allegedly showed David at the scene. But for Sarah, the case was more than just a legal matter. David's words echoed in her mind. "I didn't do this, Sarah. You know me better than anyone." He spoke with a quiet strength, yet his voice trembled with a vulnerability that Sarah hadn't seen since their childhood. She couldn't help but remember the countless times they had confided in each other, when they had promised to look out for one another, no matter what life threw their way. As the trial wore on, Sarah's internal struggle deepened. How could she possibly remain impartial when the defendant was someone she had known her entire life? She had spent years honing her legal expertise, yet all of that seemed irrelevant now. How could she follow the law when her heart was torn between the man she had once called her best friend and the professional judge she had become? Sarah was trained to make decisions based on facts and evidence, but in this case, the truth seemed elusive. The legal world had taught her to set aside personal biases. But how could she do that when the stakes were so personal? As the trial progressed, she found herself remembering their childhood, the bond they had shared, and the unjust world that had placed David at the mercy of a biased system. Despite her best efforts to remain impartial, Sarah couldn't escape the truth that had always haunted her. The system wasn't designed for people like David. It wasn't designed for someone who had been born into poverty, someone whose skin color alone could determine his fate. And now, that same system was putting him in a position where the odds seemed stacked against him. When David took the stand, his testimony was heartfelt and raw. He described how, as a young black man, he had faced obstacles that Sarah could never fully understand. He spoke about the discrimination, the stereotypes, and the way the world had always viewed him as guilty, even before he had done anything wrong. "I never stood a chance," David said, his voice breaking. "But that doesn't mean I'm guilty of this crime." Sarah's heart ached as she listened to him. She wanted to believe him. She knew him. But her job, her duty as a judge, was to look at the facts, not the person standing before her. The trial reached its conclusion, and after careful deliberation, the jury acquitted David of all charges. The room was filled with a mixture of relief and confusion. Sarah had followed the law, but as the verdict was read, she couldn't help but wonder, was justice truly served? As David walked out of the courtroom, he stopped by Sarah's desk. "Thank you," he said, offering a weary smile. "I know you did your job." Sarah nodded, but as she watched him leave, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the real battle for justice was far from over. It wasn't just about the verdict. It was about changing the system that had allowed her childhood friend to be accused in the first place. The courtroom was filled with tension as Judge Sarah Miller sat at the bench, her eyes narrowed with focus. Across from her, in the defendant's chair, sat David Johnson, her childhood friend from Westbrook, Louisiana. The years had flown by since they last saw each other, but the memories of their youth were still fresh. They had grown up in a small, racially divided town, a place where friendship could easily be torn apart by societal forces. But now, those same forces seemed to have conspired against David. He was accused of a violent crime, assault and robbery. The same boy she once played baseball with was now shackled and facing the prospect of years in prison. The prosecution's case seemed built on shaky ground from the start. The star evidence against David was a grainy surveillance video, one that was almost impossible to make out. The image was unclear, distorted by poor quality, and the figure on the screen could have been anyone. As Sarah watched the footage for the 100th time, she couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of doubt. Was this really enough to convict someone? Her mind kept going back to her childhood memories of David, a boy full of hope and dreams. The person she knew couldn't possibly be the person in the video. Officer Thomas Blake, the arresting officer, was the next to testify. His testimony was weak. He claimed to have arrested David based on a vague description from a witness, a man in dark clothing, which, according to Blake, matched David's appearance. But Sarah knew how unreliable such a description could be. She had seen it countless times before. The kind of witness who believed they had seen something definitive, but in reality, their memory was clouded by uncertainty. "Did you see David at the scene yourself?" Rachel Adams, David's defense attorney, asked Blake during cross-examination. "No," Blake admitted, his voice losing its earlier conviction. "I just went on the witness's description." "And you're telling me," Rachel pressed, "that you arrested a man based solely on a vague description? That's all you had?" Blake shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for the question. "Yes," he said, his voice quieter now. The lack of evidence was undeniable, and Sarah could feel the weight of the prosecution's case slipping away. But Rachel wasn't finished. She called in Dr. Emily West, a forensic video expert, to testify about the surveillance footage. Dr. West explained that the video had been edited and lacked sufficient clarity to identify anyone. The poor quality of the footage made it impossible to draw any concrete conclusions about who was present at the scene of the crime. "Can we definitively say that the person in this video is David Johnson?" Rachel asked, her gaze fixed on Dr. West. "No," Dr. West replied firmly. "The video cannot be used to make that identification." The courtroom fell silent as the weight of Dr. West's words settled in. The one piece of evidence that the prosecution had hinged everything on had just been torn apart. Rachel's strategy was clear. She wasn't just defending David, she was systematically dismantling the case against him. And with each new revelation, Sarah's confidence in the prosecution's case continued to waver. Rachel didn't stop there. She went after the witnesses who had placed David at the scene. One witness had claimed to have seen David at the crime scene, but under Rachel's questioning, that testimony crumbled. The witness admitted that they hadn't seen David's face clearly and were unsure of the time frame. Another witness had been swayed by media coverage of the case, their testimony influenced by what they had read in the news. Each of the prosecution's witnesses was exposed as unreliable, and the cracks in their case grew wider and wider. If you enjoyed this intense and thought-provoking video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping content that explores the complexities of life, law, and truth. Stay tuned for more incredible stories. As Rachel's defense strategy took shape, Sarah couldn't ignore the mounting evidence of doubt. The prosecution's case was riddled with holes. There were no solid witnesses, no concrete forensic evidence, and no reliable video footage to tie David to the crime. The case against him seemed to be built on nothing more than assumptions and circumstantial evidence. Sarah was no longer sure what to believe. Was David really guilty, or was he the victim of a flawed investigation, a scapegoat in a system that had failed him? When the defense rested its case, the jury was left with little to go on. The evidence simply didn't add up. But Sarah still felt a deep unease as the jury began deliberating. As a judge, her job was to follow the law, to be impartial and fair. But in this case, the line between justice and the law was blurry. Could she truly separate her personal history with David from her professional duty to the law? The jury deliberated for hours, and the room seemed to grow colder with each passing minute. The tension was unbearable. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about her old friend, the boy she had known as a child, the boy who had been wrongfully accused and unjustly treated by the system. Could the truth really be this simple? Finally, the jury returned with a verdict. David Johnson was acquitted of all charges. As the courtroom erupted in murmurs of surprise and relief, Sarah sat back in her chair, feeling a mix of emotions. On one hand, justice had been served, but on the other hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that the system had let down so many others like David. The case had exposed the flaws in the judicial process, the lack of evidence, the unreliable witnesses, and the way people like David could easily be caught in a web of suspicion. David approached her after the verdict, his expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Sarah. I knew you'd see the truth." Sarah nodded, her heart heavy. "It's not just about the truth, David," she said quietly. "It's about making sure the system works for everyone." The words lingered in the air as Sarah watched David leave the courtroom, a free man. But for Sarah, the case wasn't over. It had left her questioning not just the verdict, but the very nature of justice itself. There was more work to be done, both in the courtroom and outside of it. She vowed to keep fighting for a system that worked for all, no matter their past or their circumstances. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as David Johnson, the accused, slowly made his way to the witness stand. His every step seemed measured, as if the weight of the situation was pressing down on him with every movement. Judge Sarah Miller, who had known David since childhood, watched him with a somber expression, feeling the gravity of the moment. Her hands were clasped together, her usually stern face reflecting something different now, an undeniable empathy. David's defense attorney, Rachel Adams, gave him a brief but encouraging nod as he approached the stand. Rachel knew this moment would be pivotal, not just for the case, but for David's future. It was time for the jury to hear David's side of the story. They needed to hear the man behind the accusation. David cleared his throat before speaking. His voice was calm, but there was a rawness to it that commanded attention. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his eyes sweeping over the faces of the 12 strangers who would decide his fate. "I stand before you today, not as a man with a criminal past, but as someone who has spent his life fighting for a chance, fighting against the very system that's now trying to put me away." He paused for a moment, his words hanging in the air. The jury shifted slightly in their seats, sensing that this wasn't just another courtroom speech. It was something deeper, something personal. David continued, his voice gaining strength with every word. "I grew up in Westbrook, Louisiana. A small town, a place where people like me, people who look like me, don't often get a fair shot. I didn't grow up with a silver spoon. My mother worked 2 jobs just to make sure we had enough to eat. And every day, I had to fight harder than anyone to prove I was worthy of respect, of opportunity. But that's not how the world works, is it?" David's gaze briefly flicked toward Officer Thomas Blake, the arresting officer, before returning to the jury. He took a deep breath before continuing. "I've been pulled over more times than I can count. Not because I did anything wrong, but because of the color of my skin. I've been stared at, whispered about, treated like I'm guilty of something before I've even had a chance to speak. This is what my life has been like. And today I stand accused of something I didn't do. A crime I didn't commit. Rachel, sitting behind him, felt her heart racing. She knew that David's words were reaching the jury, that they were feeling the weight of his words. But she also knew that this wasn't just about his innocence. It was about something much bigger. The systemic issues that plagued their society, the injustice that so many like David faced every day. David looked down for a moment, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. "I know I'm not perfect," he said quietly. "I've made mistakes, sure. We all have. But I know in my heart, I didn't do what I'm being accused of. And it kills me to think that I could spend years in prison for a crime I didn't commit." His voice cracked, and for a moment the courtroom seemed to breathe collectively. The jury leaned in, hanging on his every word. "I didn't attack that woman. I didn't rob that store. I was at home that night, alone. But because of my past, because of where I come from, I'm being treated like a criminal. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is something I can't accept. I won't accept." Rachel stood up and moved toward him, her voice calm but firm. "David, can you explain to the jury how your experiences with law enforcement might have shaped how you interact with police?" David nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the exhaustion of a lifetime of fighting. "Every time I've been pulled over, I've been scared," he said. "Scared that I wouldn't make it out of the situation alive. Scared that one wrong move would be my last. That fear, it doesn't go away. It's something you carry with you every single day. And when you're constantly treated like a suspect, it wears on you. It makes you wonder, does anyone ever see me as just a person, as a human being?" His words seemed to resonate with the jury. There were no more casual glances, no more shifting in seats. David's honesty had struck a chord with them. The jury wasn't just hearing the words of a defendant, they were hearing the reality of his life. The brutal truth of what it meant to be a black man in a world where justice wasn't always blind. David took another breath, gathering his thoughts. "I'm not asking for sympathy," he continued. "I'm just asking for a chance. A chance to be seen for who I truly am, not just for the color of my skin or the place I come from. I'm innocent, and I deserve a fair trial. I deserve a shot at justice." There was a deep silence in the room, broken only by the sound of the jury scribbling notes. David's testimony wasn't just powerful, it was transformative. It forced everyone in the room, from the judge to the jury, to reconsider everything they thought they knew about this case. As David finished, Judge Miller's expression remained inscrutable. But inside, she couldn't help but feel a deep respect for the man she had known for so long. His words had made her see him not just as a defendant, but as someone who had fought a lifetime of battles that most would never understand. The courtroom fell into a stillness that would last far beyond the trial. It was a silence that spoke of reflection, of understanding, and of the profound impact David's testimony had left on all who had listened. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the clock ticked down. David Johnson stood, a lump in his throat, his palms sweating. He had waited for this moment all his life, and now it was here. Today wasn't just about his future, it was about the future of justice, about the fight for fairness in a system built on assumption and prejudice. As Judge Sarah Miller stood from her bench, she glanced around the courtroom. The eyes of everyone in the room were locked on her, holding their breath. The jury's decision had been a long time coming. They had deliberated for hours, but now they were ready. It was time for the verdict that would define the fate of David Johnson. Judge Miller's steady voice filled the air. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a woman in her 40s with a furrowed brow, stood and nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The silence in the room was deafening. David felt as though time itself had slowed. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, the pounding of nerves as the final moment approached. His defense attorney, Rachel Adams, stood beside him, her calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions raging within. She squeezed his shoulder, offering a silent, reassuring gesture that somehow felt like it weighed a ton. Judge Miller nodded and motioned for the foreperson to approach. The room watched as the foreperson handed the slip of paper to the judge. She read it quietly, then looked up. David Johnson, she began, her voice echoing across the courtroom, the jury has found you not guilty of the charges brought against you. David's knees went weak. He wanted to collapse, to let out the breath he'd been holding in for what felt like an eternity. But he stood there, still, as the weight of the words slowly sank in. Not guilty. The courtroom exploded into murmurs, but David only heard the ringing silence in his ears. The world outside seemed to fade away. It was as if, for the first time in his life, he had been handed a second chance, a chance to reclaim his dignity and his future. Rachel's face softened with a smile, but her eyes never left David. She knew how much this meant to him. She knew the demons he had fought, the same demons that had haunted him for years, every time he was stopped by a cop, every time he was accused of something he didn't do. She had watched as he stood up in that courtroom, fighting not just for his freedom, but for his very identity. The prosecutor's lips curled into a tight frown, but they offered no words of protest. The jury had spoken and there was nothing more to be said. David turned toward Rachel, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't know if this day would ever come. Thank you. Thank you for believing in me. Rachel placed a hand on his arm, her eyes meeting his. This is what we do. We fight for justice, and today we won. But the win wasn't just about being cleared of charges. It was about the hope that this victory could mean something more. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every black man who had been wrongfully accused, for every person who had been silenced, for every face in the crowd that had been ignored. If you enjoyed this intense and thought-provoking video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping content that explores the complexities of life, law, and truth. Stay tuned for more incredible stories. As the courtroom began to empty, David felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the jury, who saw through the layers of prejudice, who didn't simply take the words of the prosecution at face value. Gratitude for Rachel, who had walked alongside him every step of the way. Gratitude for the moment that felt like a lifetime coming. Judge Miller looked out across the courtroom, her face betraying no emotion. But inside she felt a stir of reflection. She had seen this case from the bench, from the perspective of someone who had spent her life in the courtroom. But today, she couldn't ignore the broader implications. She couldn't ignore how fragile the balance of justice could be. Not guilty, she repeated quietly to herself, her thoughts lingering on the weight of the decision. This trial was over, but the work was just beginning. And as she looked out at David, standing tall despite the battle, she knew that this victory wasn't just his, it was everyone's. The courtroom was quiet now. The final gavel had fallen, and the echoes of the trial's tension seemed to vanish with it. Judge Sarah Miller stood still for a moment, staring down at the papers on her desk. For hours, she had been immersed in the intricacies of the law, analyzing every piece of evidence, listening to the defense and prosecution, weighing the facts. But now that the verdict was in, her thoughts began to settle, uncomfortably. David Johnson had been acquitted, not guilty. And the jury's decision, while technically justified by the law, left Sarah with a deep, unsettling feeling. She had known David since childhood. They had both grown up in Hammond, Louisiana, a town where racism was woven into the fabric of everyday life. But they had experienced it differently. While Sarah had gone on to law school, became a judge, and gained a measure of power and respect, David had remained in the small town, facing the harshness of a system that never seemed to care about people like him. David's defense attorney, Rachel Adams, had done a brilliant job, pointing out the weak, conflicting evidence, highlighting the flaws in the prosecution's case. But Rachel had done something even more powerful. She had humanized David, showing the jury that there was more to this case than just broken video footage and unreliable witnesses. Rachel had reminded the jury of the social realities that David, as a black man in America, had faced his entire life. His arrest, his charges. Everything about this case was shaped not just by the law, but by the societal biases that underpinned everything. As Sarah walked down the cold, sterile hallway of the courthouse, the weight of the decision began to settle on her. The law had been followed, yes. The rules had been applied. But had justice truly been served? She could hear David's voice in her mind. telling the jury about the countless times he had been stopped by police, about the prejudice he'd faced simply for walking down the street, about the years of feeling invisible, unimportant, or worse, guilty by default. She remembered the look in his eyes when he spoke those words, raw, vulnerable, but also defiant. It was a look Sarah hadn't seen in a long time, at least not in anyone she knew. Her privilege, she realized, had shielded her from that truth for too long. As she entered her chambers, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of discomfort. She had spent her life upholding the law, but now, for the first time, she wondered if the law itself was enough. David's case was not just a failure of the justice system in the technical sense. It was a failure of society itself. The very same system that had acquitted him was the same one that had for years labeled him a criminal before he had ever committed a crime. The law had served him this time, but how many others had it failed? Rachel had pointed out the flaws in the case, but Sarah knew that the real issue wasn't just faulty evidence. It was the underlying societal bias that influenced how people like David were seen. For people like Sarah, those biases had always been invisible. She had never needed to confront them because they didn't affect her. But now, after seeing David, after hearing his story, she could no longer ignore them. She thought back to her childhood with David. They had once shared everything. Dreams, secrets, laughter. But somehow, her path had led her into a world where people like David were treated differently. As a judge, she had been tasked with being neutral, dispassionate. She had always believed that as long as the law was followed, justice would be served. But David had reminded her that justice wasn't just about laws, it was about addressing the deeply entrenched prejudices that shaped the lives of many Americans. The verdict was in, but the work didn't stop there. Sarah knew that her role as a judge went beyond simply applying the law. It was about confronting the deep injustices that the law often perpetuated. She couldn't undo the past, but perhaps, just perhaps, she could be part of the change that was so desperately needed. It was a daunting realization, one that she could no longer ignore. As she looked out the window of her office, Sarah felt a new sense of responsibility settle over her. She had always believed in the power of the law, but now she understood that real justice required more than just legal victories. It required confronting the systems that made some people's lives harder than others, that caused people like David to be treated unfairly, time and time again. For Sarah Miller, the trial had been a turning point. She had always believed in the law, but now she understood that true justice was about more than just laws. It was about confronting the biases, the inequalities, and the systems that perpetuated them. And as she prepared for her next case, Sarah knew that she would never look at the law, or the people who came before her, the same way again. The courtroom was now empty, save for the distant echoes of footsteps. The trial was over, and Sarah Miller, her judicial robes hanging loosely around her, stood at the base of the bench. The gavel had fallen, the verdict had been read, and David Johnson, her childhood friend, the man she had known for years, was free, acquitted of all charges. But as the weight of the moment settled in, Sarah felt the stirrings of unease. David's acquittal felt like a victory for him, yes, but was it truly justice? Was this outcome a sign that the system had worked, or was it merely an exception? A rare occurrence where the law functioned as it should, despite its flaws. Sarah had done what she believed was her duty, following the letter of the law, but deep down, she could not shake the feeling that something was missing. That something far deeper, far more ingrained, had not been addressed. Stepping out of the courtroom into the evening air, Sarah caught sight of David, leaning against the courthouse steps. He was standing alone, looking up at the sky, as if trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The years they had spent together growing up in Hammond, Louisiana, came rushing back to her. They had been close once, two kids, inseparable. But now it was clear that their paths in life had diverged. He had spent his life fighting against a system that had already condemned him, while she had worked within that same system, believing it was the best way to serve justice. Sarah walked over to him slowly, the weight of the trial still on her shoulders. David looked at her as she approached, his expression unreadable, but then a faint smile tugged at his lips. "You did your job," he said quietly. "The verdict was fair. The law worked." Sarah's face faltered at his words. "I'm not sure it did, David," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "The law may have worked, but that doesn't mean justice was served. I followed the rules, but the rules themselves are part of the problem." David raised an eyebrow, his gaze thoughtful. "You're starting to see it." "Huh?" Sarah nodded, her heart heavy. "I've spent so long believing in the system, believing that as long as I followed the law, I was doing the right thing. But what if the law isn't enough? What if it's not enough to simply follow the rules when the rules are designed in a way that favors some and hurts others?" David took a deep breath, pushing himself off the steps. "It's hard to see it from the other side, Sarah. You've always had the privilege of being on the right side of things, being able to trust the system. But for me, for people like me, it's always been a battle. I've spent my whole life fighting a system that sees me as less than, that assumes guilt based on the color of my skin." Sarah felt the sting of his words. She had known about the inequality, the racial injustice, but hearing it from David, someone she had known for so long, made it hit home in a way nothing else had. "I never wanted to see it, David. I wanted to believe that things were fair, that the law was just. But now I don't know what to believe anymore." David looked at her, his eyes soft but filled with the weight of experience. "I know, Sarah. I know you wanted to believe in the system, but what you're realizing now is that the system isn't always the answer. The law isn't always just. You've got to look beyond it." Sarah's throat tightened. "But what do I do, David? How can I change things? How do I fix a system that seems so broken?" David placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice firm but compassionate. "You start by not pretending it's enough. You start by seeing the truth, by acknowledging the flaws that have been here all along. You're in a position to change things, Sarah. You have the power to make a difference." The weight of his words hung in the air. Sarah looked at him, feeling a sense of urgency she hadn't felt before. The law might be her profession, but justice, that was her responsibility. She had to fight for it, not just in the courtroom, but in every part of the system that had failed people like David for generations. "I can't let this go," she said quietly. "I won't. I'll use what I've learned today, what you've helped me see, and I'll make it my mission to change things. I won't be the same. I can't be." David smiled, a look of pride in his eyes. "I knew you'd come to this, Sarah. I knew you were capable of it." As Sarah stood there, the promise of a future with more justice, more fairness, more change flickering inside her, she knew that the fight for equality and justice had only just begun. But now, for the first time, she felt ready to face it head-on. The courtroom was silent after the verdict was read. David Johnson had been acquitted of all charges, his name cleared. But the weight of the moment was heavy, not just for him, but for Judge Sarah Miller. As she watched him leave the stand, she couldn't shake the feeling of conflict gnawing at her. Sarah stood by the large windows of her chambers, her hands resting on the windowsill, staring out at the setting sun. The case was over, but her mind was racing. Her role as a judge had always been about upholding the law, about ensuring that justice was served in accordance with the letter of the law. But what about the spirit of the law? What about fairness, equity, and the deeper truths of human experience that couldn't be captured in statutes and precedents? She thought of David. They had grown up together in Hammond, Louisiana, in a small town that was deeply divided along racial lines. She remembered the days when they would play together, share secrets, and dream of futures beyond the confines of their segregated world. Those days seemed so distant now. And yet, David's life had unfolded in a way that made it impossible to ignore the divide that had existed all around them. As a child, Sarah had the privilege of being shielded from the harsh realities of systemic inequality. Her family was well off, her opportunities abundant. But David, despite his intelligence and potential, had been forced to navigate a world where he was judged not by his character, but by the color of his skin. That reality had been clear to Sarah only in hindsight, something she never fully understood until now, standing in her role as judge, holding the scales of justice in her hands. David's acquittal wasn't just about the facts of the case. It was about something deeper, something that lingered in the air long after the trial. It was about race, about the uneven playing field that existed not only in their hometown, but in the broader world. She had ruled based on the evidence presented, and the jury had done their job. But was that enough? Was it truly justice when the system itself was flawed? Is the law really just, or is it just convenient? Sarah whispered to herself, her voice barely above a murmur. It was then that the door to her chambers creaked open, and Rachel Adams, David's defense attorney, stepped inside. Rachel had been a fierce advocate for her client, challenging every detail of the prosecution's case and raising doubts about the credibility of witnesses. "I didn't expect you to be in here alone," Rachel said, her voice soft but steady. "I needed a moment," Sarah replied, not looking away from the view. "Do you think we did the right thing?" she asked, the question hanging in the air. Rachel paused, considering the question. "We did what the law told us to do," she said. "But sometimes, the law doesn't account for the realities that people face, and sometimes the law doesn't correct its own wrongs." Rachel's words hung heavily in the room, and for the first time Sarah allowed herself to fully acknowledge the weight of her role. It wasn't just about applying the law. It was about understanding the people who came before her, the stories they carried, and the world they lived in. As the conversation lingered, Sarah's mind drifted back to her conversation with David after the trial. He had approached her, his expression somber but determined, as he made his way to the front of the courtroom. She remembered the way his eyes held hers, filled with years of unspoken pain and wisdom. "I know you did your job, Sarah," David had said, his voice steady, though tinged with emotion. "But this system, it's not built for people like me. It's not built for people like us." She had wanted to argue, to remind him that justice was blind, that the system worked if you worked within it. But something inside her stopped her. His words echoed in her mind now. "This system isn't built for people like me." The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. In that moment, she knew he was right. The system, with all its flaws and injustices, didn't account for the realities of the lives people lived. It didn't account for the deep-seated inequality that ran through every level of society. "I'll fight for change, David," she had promised him then, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "Even if I can't fix the past, I will do everything I can to fix the future." Now, standing in her chambers, Sarah knew what she had to do. She could no longer stand on the sidelines, detached from the very issues that shaped the lives of those who came before her. She had to take action. She had to be the change she wished to see in the world. The world was not perfect. The system was not perfect. But Sarah had seen enough in her time as a judge to know that justice wasn't just about following the law. It was about ensuring that everyone, regardless of who they were or where they came from, had the same chance at a fair trial, at dignity, at respect. She walked to her desk, took a deep breath, and began to draft a proposal for judicial reform. It wasn't the grand gesture she had once imagined, but it was a start to changing a system that had long been in need of overhaul. As she signed her name at the bottom of the page, Sarah felt a sense of resolve settle in her chest. There would be more trials, more difficult decisions, but now she knew what she had to do. And with that, she made a silent promise to herself, to David, and to the countless others who had been failed by the system. She would not stop until she saw change. If you enjoyed this intense and thought-provoking video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping content that explores the complexities of life, law, and truth. Stay tuned for more incredible stories.